Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Erin Tinnen with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Today's webinar is Sustaining Trauma-Informed Family-Centered Services, the 10th and last webinar in the series, Building Trauma-Informed Services for Children, Youth, and Parents Impacted by Domestic Violence. Our trainer today will be Susan Blumenfeld, MSW, LCSW, and Child Trauma Training Director for the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Before we get started, I'll go over some of the technical details of the WebEx software that we will be using for today's webinar. Many of these details are explained on the Using this WebEx System tab in the upper left-hand side of your screen as well. Please be aware that your screen might look a little different depending on whether or not you're using a Mac or a PC. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are multiple boxes. The second from the top is the chat feature. This feature will allow you to provide feedback and share resources with your fellow colleagues, as well as get in contact with the trainers or myself if you have any questions regarding the training content. You may contact Jennifer Curley, also with the center, if you have questions troubleshooting the WebEx software. To do this, click the down-facing arrow and select the person you would like to contact. You'll see a lot of options, but for this session, you'll want to select all participants if you would like to respond to a question from the trainer or get in contact me anytime during the session. You should click on Jennifer Curley to privately contact her if you're in need of troubleshooting the WebEx software. So let's test this chat feature. Will everyone please go to the chat box, click on All Participants, type in the program you are calling from, and then press Enter. Give folks a second to go ahead and do that. Perfect. Excellent. Y'all can continue to do that as well. Thank you so much for that. While folks can get a lot out of the chat feature, there are times when it moves really quickly and can feel distracting. If this is true for you, you can feel free to minimize the chat box by clicking the arrow next to where it says chat. You can always open it again with the same arrow if you choose. We will be providing live captioning during this webinar. Below the chat box, there is a media viewer box. This will contain the captions. If you do not want to see the captions, click on the down-facing arrow next to the word Media Viewer, the same way you might if you want to hide the chat box. At the end of the webinar, you will be taken to a very brief evaluation. Please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better. If you get disconnected from the webinar at any point, return to the email you received with the original webinar link and re-enter the training. Sometimes sound cuts out due to internet connection, so feel free to call into the landline if that's a problem for you. If you're experiencing technical difficulties and are unable to contact Jennifer Curley, you may call the WebEx tech support to resolve any additional issues. That phone number, which we will also post in the chat box, is 1-866-229-3239. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will now turn the training over to Susan.
Thank you, Erin, for that introduction, and welcome everybody. As Erin said, this is our final and culminating webinar in this series, and we're excited that you have joined us today. We have the same slide on all of these. This is just to remind you that we're here as a center to help you find resources and help in any way we can, and we've got lots of webinars and other things that you can download. So please take a look at what we've got to offer. It changes all the time. Okay, so let's begin like we usually do and get comfortable in your seats or wherever you are. And if you feel like it, shake out your arms and legs and get rid of some of that old energy. And then what we like to do is just come into the present moment to be together on this webinar through our breath. And so if you want to join me, please take a deep breath in through your nose. And you might say to yourself something like, my body is filling with calm, and then release the breath out through your mouth. And you may use an audible, and again, that helps us kind of clear out our energy and come into the present. So let's do that together for a few breaths. Breath in and out. Breath in and out. One more time. Breath in and out. So we use this as a way of really settling in so that we can kind of focus and be here in the present moment. And as we say in all of these, it's important for you to decide what the right distance and closeness is for you with the things that we're talking about. Feel free to doodle, get up, take a break, yawn, stretch. I won't see you. And remember also that you can always come back to this webinar since we archive it. So welcome again, and thanks for joining us today. So I was thinking back on what we have offered through this series, and I just want to mention briefly some of the things that we've highlighted, because what we're talking about today really builds on that foundation. So we've talked about the potential traumatic impact of domestic violence on children and on their ongoing development. We've explored how domestic violence affects survivors, their children, and their relationships with each other. We've paired those considerations with an understanding of what buffers and protects children from the harmful effects, and what fosters healing and resilience. And one of the key takeaways that I've talked about at different times is that I deeply believe that the single greatest resource for healing and resilience are children's relationships with their protective parents and caregivers. We've also talked about the impact of the work on us, using the term secondary trauma, and we've offered and thought about individual and organizational strategies for navigating our own responses and stress on the job and for reducing burnout. And we're going to revisit that today when we talk about reflective supervision and consultation. We've explored the role of frontline staff in supporting families affected by domestic violence, and we introduced a resiliency-based framework that our center calls SAS. And many of you are familiar with this now if you've attended our webinars. But the components of SAS are S for safety, A for attachment, or those caregiving attachment relationships that children have. The second S is for self-regulation. And the fourth and final S stands for self-esteem, and a term that we call self-efficacy. And the latter refers to a sense that who I am matters to those around me, and that I can have a positive impact on my own world. And all of those things taken together help us heal and lead towards resilience. We hope you've gained practical strategies for how to engage in sensitive conversations with survivors about their parenting, and in general, how to support nonviolent parents and their children in your day-to-day work. As I've mentioned before, all of these webinars have been archived, and the recordings and accompanying PowerPoint and handouts are available to you if you want to go back or review or you've missed one or two. Today, we will revisit strategies for enhancing and sustaining trauma-informed family-centered services. We'll discuss individual and organizational supports, and as I mentioned, including reflective supervision and consultation. We've also set aside time to respond to some of the questions raised during the series. And there will also be an opportunity for you to raise questions and issues from previous webinars or what comes up today towards the end. So I also want to just take a moment to pause here before we go on to give my heartfelt thanks to both Jennifer Curley and Erin Tinnen from our center, who have done an amazing job of supporting this webinar series. So I'm very grateful to each of them. And I also wanted to thank those of you who have filled out the evaluations, because it's so helpful to us, not only from the standpoint of how we can improve them, but hearing from you about what was important, what your ongoing questions are. We also have some great ideas for future webinars based on what you're interested in. So thank you as well. Okay, so the webinar in which we introduced this topic was webinar 5, and I'd encourage people to audit it if you haven't already. And I'm going to just recap and summarize some of the key points as we think about this topic today. Okay, so making a shift. I think from what I'm hearing from around the country, what I heard about from your evaluations, that people are in different places with where they're at on a continuum of offering trauma-informed family-centered services. And so it's really helpful, I believe, to think about what's our starting point. What are we currently offering for survivors? What are we offering for children, families? What kinds of parenting supports and services are we offering? And do we offer any parent-child services together? Then the second part of this that I think is absolutely critical and can be a longer or a longish process is taking the time within your teams, within your program organization, to engage in what I'm calling framing conversations, so that we have a chance together to talk about what does it mean to us to offer services to children, teens, and families. What does it mean to really think about survivors who are parenting and look at that role and hold that role front and center? And what are the expectations that we brought to our current role? And I think I said last time that we've heard people who are fabulous adult survivor advocates say, I didn't sign on to work with kids. And I think we can appreciate that and embrace that and look at that, but also think about how can we expand that role then so that you're working with adult survivors, but you're not excluding that part of who they are that has to do with being a parent. So what kinds of gifts do we bring to our work? What were our own childhood and lived experiences so far in our lives? And what barriers, really honestly and realistically, do we think are there in terms of making this shift? So all of those things I think can be very helpful to be explored. Some other thoughts on this are, what are our beliefs about parenting styles and a range of culturally based practices? What happens when those beliefs or practices are different than what we value or different than what we grew up with? And really being conscious of that and thinking about how can we be more inclusive and mindful of a range of styles. And then certainly, and I think this comes up in shelter settings, how do we support parents to make decisions about their families and their children and support their autonomy and not be so rule-driven that we really create barriers that work against us and at worst could be re-traumatizing. Then there's the issue of if we're thinking about family-centered services and their teenage boys in the family, how are we serving them then if we're offering shelter services? And I think that the other thing that comes up is that when we start holding both the parent and child survivor and child in mind at the same time, that we're looking not only at the DV survivor's safety, but the safety of children. And that adds another layer of complexity in our thinking about safety and our services. So, for instance, how do we handle issues of confidentiality? And for those of you that are mandated reporters, how are we prepared to do this? Are Are we weighing risks and benefits before reporting? What's that based on? How do we establish a trusting relationship with a survivor who's parenting, where there may be some issues that are of quite serious concern to us about their children's safety? And when do we present what our role is? Some people really believe strongly that we lay on the table that we're mandated reporters from the beginning. Others feel like that might shift even developing a relationship, and it's better as the relationship develops to then introduce that so that people don't entrust us with information that might be harmful to them, but at the same time keeping in mind the safety of children. I think then when we look at family-centered services, what's our relationship with Child Protective Services in our community? And are we able to work with that provider, set of providers, in a way that allows us to talk about the ways in which survivors do take protective actions on behalf of their children that might get misinterpreted? And this was something that we've covered in the past. But again, all of this has to come into our preparation for thinking about offering family-centered services. A couple of other issues that I think come up that are related. I think that we can be very good at helping survivors figure out what their options are when they're ready to leave. But we may become more ambivalent and conflicted when we know that if they're in shelter, they're returning home to an abusive partner. And as we've gotten to know the children better and they've been vocal about what's going on, what that sets up for us or stirs up for us in terms of the implications. And hopefully within, maybe this goes without saying, but hopefully we have been open enough that we're not giving survivors the message that we'll serve you and we're there for you if you're going to separate, but if you don't, forget it. So in a word, I think it's helpful to know and to trust that a survivor knows what is going to be what she feels is in her best interest and her children's best interest in the moment. How do we offer services for our center-based services when we know that domestic violence is ongoing? Or there's some, if the family isn't all living together, we know there's a lot of informal contact. After separation, how do we help support the nonviolent parent to facilitate children's relationships with their parents who have been abusive partners? What are our relationships with community partners within the child serving systems like schools and daycare? What's our relationship with services that are out there for better intervention programs and other kinds of services? How do we feel about them? What are our connections to them? And I think examining all of that openly and frankly, and then having some kind of structure for how we're going to conduct our program is really essential and important. And then the last part of this is really figuring out what are the right resources then. If we want to move more in this direction, what's it going to take? What do we need? What's going to help us to carry this forward? So as I said earlier, having trauma-informed services for families means keeping in mind both the needs of the adult survivor who's parenting and his children. So they may have very different needs in the moment. You may have a teenager that's saying, I don't want my mother to go back. It's just going to be the same thing again. This has happened so many times. And you may have a parent in that moment who is feeling that this is the best option, or vice versa. The child really wants to be reunited with the parent who's been abusive, and but to their other parent. And let's say in this instance that the mother is feeling strongly that this is what's going to be best to keep herself safe and her children safe. So these scenarios are it can be fluid, and the needs can change at different times. And we have to be responsive then to those needs. And we know that raising children calls on our reserves of patience, energy, sensitive attention, all of which can be so much harder when we ourselves are recovering from the traumatic effects of domestic violence as an adult. So as we're thinking about trauma-informed services for families, we want to think about the impact of trauma in the lives of these children and the parent and this family, and also to think developmentally about children's needs. So I think, you know, one way, if we're looking at creating environments that are welcoming and inclusive, really thinking about what do children at different ages need. If they're coming into a residential living situation, what do we have at the child's eye level and within reach? Have we created spaces, both within our center-based programs and shelters, that are spaces for children and parents together? So that might be a quiet corner with soft pillows and books. There might be soothing music. But so that we have some spaces demarcated that are welcoming and that allow for supporting that relationship. For teens, are we really thinking about giving them more opportunity for more independence and choice and autonomy based on their developmental capacities? Do we have space that's designated for teens, just as we might have space that's more adult space for survivors? But again, I mean, I want to caution us to think about every child and adolescent as an individual. Some teens may not feel comfortable relating to their peers. They may be more isolative. They may want more time alone. They may be listening to music with their earbuds or on their phones, or if the center or a shelter has a computer, on their computer. So really kind of thinking about who we're serving and what their needs are. For school-age children, do we have space for them to do homework if it's a living situation? Are we thinking about what children's capacities are developmentally? Because we know that the traumatic effects of experiencing domestic violence and maybe other trauma that occurs at the same time can really have an impact on how children are able to master developmental tasks that are more within their age range. So, for instance, you might have a 7-year-old who really loves playing board games, Chutes and Ladders, or other kinds of games. You may have the same 7-year-old who gets too dysregulated when he or she isn't winning, and it's not a good choice to have board games out there because it's too hard for them at this point. They may get there with some help and support. So really thinking about all of these things as we think about creating trauma-informed services for families. When people walk into our program spaces, do they see themselves represented in what's up on the walls and what's around them? And does it feel welcoming and inclusive? And we're thinking about the physical environment, the sensory environment, and also thinking about the relationships and the connections that we form and have. Okay. So we talked a lot about being family-centered in the prior webinar, and I hope that if it's reflected in the culture of our organization, that there's family voice that's helped us get there in terms of what parents and children want and what's meaningful to them. And that can be fluid too in terms of our organization and what we do. And then thinking about how does this parent, how does this family, how do the children define family? I like to ask kids, to draw a picture of their family, because that's always really interesting to me, because you get a lot of good information for those kids that are, have the fine motor ability to draw, of course. You find out who the family pets are, and maybe grandma is a really important person that has been living with the family, but now they're in shelter. And you get information about how they're feeling about the abusive partner. Is that parent or caregiver in the picture? And then if we have that kind of mindset, we're able to provide, particularly for families in shelter, we're able to provide a sense of continuity, to recognize this as a transition, to be able to talk about what the losses are, what the separations are, and also to help families think about the future and what's coming next. So family-centered services are about including support, a discussion about children, and the experience of parenting as part of our routine tasks. Ann Brickson, who used to be with End Abuse Wisconsin, has the phrase, how can I use this task, no matter what your role is in the organization, to better support parent-child relationships? So that may be when we're taking crisis calls during a court process that'll impact visitation or custody arrangements, in a myriad of transitions that take place. But asking parents, what's going well? Do you have any worries or concerns about your children? And also having them share things that they're proud of about their children and their families. And so within this, we want to look at both the concrete needs that are related to children, but also looking at emotional support. And we can ask about that with parents. And then what do our services look like? What are we offering? I know that a lot of centers have group-based services. So are we offering parenting support groups? If we have family groups, what do those look like? When we do family-based activities, it's really important to think developmentally. So I think those kinds of issues come into thinking about being family-centered. And it's staff-centered in that we're really redefining ownership for who responds and how we respond to issues related to children, parents, and families. So it's not the lone child advocate who is responsible for handling problems that might arise. So, and usually those problems are around the kid scribbled on the wall, or the kid took the bike and kind of smashed it into the wall. You know, it was winter and there was no opportunity to go out, and, you know, those kinds of things. And I think that when we get to a point where everybody is prepared and equipped to support the family in dealing with whatever comes up, that we've really created something that's more family-friendly and staff-centered. And the other piece, and I may say a little bit about this more a little later, is that when it's not just the children's advocate that's working with the kids, but it's everybody in some capacity, and that means advocates, other staff, volunteers, it helps us fill in the picture together, and we feel supported in supporting the family, and we also get a different window on what an individual child's and parents' strengths and capacities might be, because all of us relate differently to different people, right? And depending on our role, we may see different things, and filling in that picture together is really in the best interest of the family. So in webinar 5, we mentioned 2 resources that will help you look in more detail around having some of these framing conversations, thinking about the different aspects that come to mind for building trauma-informed services. And the first is our tool, our ACDVTI tool, which stands for Accessible, Culturally, I'm going to screw this up, culturally relevant and DV-sensitive trauma-informed tool. It's a mouthful, guys, but it's very, very helpful. We revised it in August, and we're going to have a final version out in the next few months. Then I also mentioned a resource that's on the Promising Futures website that was put together by Amy Torsha with the Vermont Network. So I invite you to check those out. I'm assuming some of you have already looked at these and maybe working with them, and we'd love to hear from you in terms of how it's been helpful or where you might have gotten stuck and what else would be important to know. So at this point, I'd like to pause if there are any questions. I'm looking in the chat box. I'm going to give you a chance. We are going to go on in a moment to talk about sustaining trauma-informed family-centered services. So it's going to be more on this topic, but maybe something came up now that you'd like to ask about. All right, well, you'll have another opportunity to do so. Okay, so how do we sustain these services? And I think this is a huge takeaway. Being trauma-informed and family-centered is a process. It's not a checklist. It's fluid. It needs constant tending and care. It's not something that, okay, I've arrived there. But we're going to talk about ways in which what can help us sustain this in the future. But first, of course, you've had those framing conversations and you're ready to move forward. That's the big first piece here. Okay, so what are the key organizational supports when we're thinking about sustaining these practices? And this is no small task, but really thinking about how is this integrated into our vision, our mission statement, our policies, procedures. Is it part of what we think about when we recruit staff and hire and when we think about retention of staff? I talked about some of the ways in which we're looking at more supporting parents in this role so we can strengthen the parent-child relationship and foster healing and resilience. And it takes an ongoing allocation of resources. We know our resources are stretched. We really never probably have enough to do what we need to do when we think about what the need is out there in the community and from the families that we're working with. So it means having some really interesting and perhaps difficult conversations about how are we going to allocate resources. I think this next one is huge. I strongly believe that if we're going to offer trauma-informed family-centered services, that there has to be a general orientation for all staff within the program and agency. And so what I have in mind is whoever answers the phone. Now, I know in some smaller organizations, people take turns and rotate on answering the phones and taking the crisis line. But some of you may have a receptionist if you're a larger program. The maintenance staff, if you have a shelter, the house manager, all of our advocates, supervisors, if you have part-time or full-time mental health clinicians, volunteers. Everybody together is creating that welcoming, inclusive environment that's trauma-informed. And if folks are not all on the same page, it's really not going to happen in the way that it needs to. And so it calls for a little bit of creativity, particularly if you're doing shelter-based services, because it means having others fill in while you're having training. And I also think of training as not just sort of passively getting information about being trauma-informed and family-centered, but really having opportunities to think about and reflect on what we're talking about and how does that impact me in my role, and what other supports then am I going to need to do, and what am I doing that's really awesome that is contributing to this, and is there some other help or support that I need if I'm going to really embrace this vision in a different way. So, you know, looking at skills that are specific to your own role. Then I think another huge part of a general orientation is thinking about how do we handle those common areas within the shelter or the center, and who is going to respond to whatever might come up. So if everybody's trained, we have the tools that we need, we have the confidence to be able to intervene if we see two kids fighting and the parent isn't around, for instance. I know that when I worked in a center-based program, I think one of the best things I ever did was to train our receptionist, who also had an eye over the area that was in the waiting room. So we did a lot of counseling services, and often we wanted to have some private time with the parents alone. And by giving some supports and understanding to the receptionist and having her think through what might come up and how did we even, what kind of toys did we have? What did we have there? What was the age of the kids that we were serving? What could, you know, what kinds of things could be put away if we had really little kids and we were afraid that they'd put things in their mouth that would be a choking hazard. All of those kinds of aspects as we think about delivering services become really critical. What do our common living areas look like in the shelter? And do we have the supports there so that anybody within that common area and space who's walking through feels comfortable relating, supporting, intervening if they need to? And as I think that so many of the topics that we covered within the series are some of what it's helpful to have training on. So the impact of domestic violence on children and families, thinking from a developmentally and culturally sensitive perspective, and more on thinking about child and family inclusive programming and having ongoing training and supports. So once you get the basics and it makes sense to you and you have a sense of what you need to do, then what? You know, how do I apply that to my day-to-day practice? And who's there to help me kind of figure out, is this going well, or I did something and it didn't seem to work very well, and how can we support each other in that process? So the next part really has to do with what I alluded to previously, which is so many of our programs, unfortunately, end up separating out the role of the children's advocate and the role of the survivor's advocates. Some of you do have family advocates, and I think that's wonderful, and you don't have those kinds of splits within your services. But it doesn't matter. Even if you have those splits, the roles can be distinct, but are we communicating? Are we supporting each other? Are we on this kind of same page? So offering services for children this probably goes without saying, is not babysitting so that you can do the real services with adults. And it's really an impossible and unfair task to ask one person to be oversighting an activity for children ranging in age from toddlers through teens. So we want to think developmentally about what we're offering to children if it's in a group setting, and I feel really strongly that if we're doing group-based services for children and we're looking at them more developmentally, so we would divide them up, that by age and developmental capacity, that we want at least another co-facilitator for a group. And sometimes, depending on what the needs are and how large the group is, it's really helpful to have another trained volunteer there as well. Because otherwise, if something comes up for a child and they become dysregulated or upset or something's going on, then the facilitator can't really meet that child's needs and continue to offer a group and do activities. So want to put in a huge pitch for that. I also want to say that when we have a trauma-informed approach, that children benefit from a range of social connections. So, you know, I've seen kids who are following around the house manager and helping with move things around, or set the table, or do other kinds of things, and it's really important for them. And they develop a relationship, and that relationship is so healing and beautiful to see. So we want to be able to promote this and also to promote communication. So in a shelter, if you've got overnight staff, I know that staff put notes in, you know, whatever the log is that you're keeping, so you're aware if something happened or what went on. But it doesn't really take the place for figuring out a way to have team-based conversations where you can share what your perspectives are, share what's come up, and be able, again, sometimes to see those strengths and capacities that you may not have been aware of. But also, lots of important information may be there that's going to help us serve the family better. Okay, so many of us have had the experience of building up a program, including our relationships with different key community partners, and then experiencing or learning about, after we've left the agency, that there were shifts in the organization, and what we built felt like it's kind of disintegrated in some ways, which is very difficult to recognize or to be part of when it's happening. So I think that the safeguard for that is really figuring out, is this approach interwoven into the fabric of our organization? If it's a part of what we pride ourselves on as an organization, then we have a better chance of it continuing when there are inevitable changes in leadership, staff, and board. I think it's got to be embedded in our mission and the lived experiences of all of the members of the organization. The voices of survivors and their children are part of that investment. And I've certainly talked with executive directors who are survivors themselves, who have raised a family and they're now in this leadership position, or they're on the board of an agency. And part of why they're successful with this is that they've thought back on, looking back on their own journey, what was helpful to me and my children, what services were supportive, and what we're missing, and how can we create an organization that's really going to hold all the needs of the children and the survivors that we're serving now. And I think that if this is going to happen, we have to see the clear benefits for the families we serve and for ourselves in this process. So I think that when our services or programs become more trauma-informed and child and family-centered, we begin to redefine and actively listen for what families want and need from us. One of my favorite examples is really experienced shelter supervisor, went through some local training that we did in Chicago and was part of a group that we had. And as she shifted their shelter services. She said she was hearing from some of the mothers who were working full-time, please don't do family nights on Fridays. We're exhausted after a week of work. Or things like, you know, respect and allow a survivor who's come to shelter, who needs some transition time, to just rest and recover without being pulled into 10 different meetings and groups that I have to attend before I'm really ready to or can take in the information. So those are just two examples. But I think that part of what keeps this kind of investment going is that we see before our very eyes that the relationships between survivors and their children become stronger. Children's needs are better understood. There's more of a sense of emotional safety and security. Strategies for self-regulation are practiced, and we've offered a lot of those along the way in this series. And we have a chance to really observe, promote, and celebrate strengths and emerging capacities and positive changes. And that's what keeps anybody going when you're in a change and recovery process, right? I also think that if we're running an organization that's truly trauma-informed, it can help diminish some of those relational tangles and tensions and missteps that can be so time and energy consuming, that can come up with families and can come up with staff. And that if we have this sort of awareness, it really allows us to process things differently and make repairs, realize that we all make mistakes, and to move on in a different way. So staff feels more productive and creative and hopeful, and also more autonomous within their roles, and very importantly, connected to others on the staff, so that we're doing this as part of a community. I'm not doing my work in isolation. And with that, I think you might find that people are taking less sick days, that there's the work that they're doing is more productive and creative and high quality. Okay. So reflective supervision and consultation. Some of you are very familiar with this. Others of you may not be as familiar. And to get into thinking about this, in webinar 8, which was engaging parents and caregivers in sensitive conversations, I introduced two guiding principles. And the first was start with where the parent's at. So that sense of the example that I just gave, if a parent is feeling absolutely depleted and exhausted, to be in a meeting about how I can improve my parenting is not going to be particularly effective. So being able to gauge that and being attuned both to what somebody's telling us and what they might not be saying, but we can feel or sense from their body language or from other, in other ways, and by just being sensitively attuned. And then the companion principle is start with where we are at ourselves. What's coming up for us as we're doing this work? So really practicing a kind of mindful awareness. And there's a tie-in with that and how I think about reflective supervision and consultation. So I see both of those as critical supports for frontline staff and supervisors that allow us to do high-quality services. So for example, I've heard folks in center-based programs saying, we've got this one family, we've got this one mom, we've given so much to her in our time, in our resources and energy, and it's just feeling like it's a sieve. Doesn't matter what we say, what we offer, what we do, nothing's changing. And in some situations, part of what the sort of charge is for us, emotional charge, is that we're carrying some serious concerns about the children's well-being and their safety. So this would be an example of something that could come up for us in the course of doing our work. A shelter example might be that sometimes a survivor may have a really great relationship with a particular staff person. They really click, and that person, the survivor who's parenting, feels really understood and cared for. And then they may have more tension with another person. And it may be because that other person reminds me of my mean cousin and what happened to me when I was a kid. Just the way they look or how they're acting or what their voice quality is like. Or this, as a staff person, I might be set off by this particular person or family, and my colleague may not be, or maybe. So it's like sorting that through. So I can think of an example of a consultation that I did where the night shift staff person was talking about difficulty and tension that she was having with this one family and parent who she talked about treating her in very kind of rude, disrespectful ways, and her 3-year-old son would get up pretty late at night, 11:30 at night, come into the main room and demand food from the worker. And the food, it seemed like, was for himself and his family. And she felt very bossed around, disturbed by the fact that this 3-year-old was taking care of himself and others in the family, and all, you get the picture. And but what we found when we did the consultation was that the same parent who had a pretty decent relationship with her main case manager, who was there during the day, was complaining about the person on the night shift, and there were different aspects that each of them had seen about this particular parent. And when they could put together and step back and explore their perspectives, the night staff person was not feeling so isolated and in some ways scapegoated, actually, if the truth be known. And so it was really helpful to be able to work that through as a team and talk about it together and think about strategies for how could they strengthen the parent's role and not have this 3-year-old doing things to take care of himself, but feeling more cared for by his parent. Okay. So now I want to talk more specifically about what we mean when we talk about reflective supervision. I've drawn a lot, and so have others, on the field of early childhood. They've really been leaders in this area and have done some great work that I think is very translatable to our services. So reflection. Reflection, it gives us an opportunity to get out of the intensity of the moment and to step back, to metabolize what our experiences were with this particular child and family, and to process it with somebody else, rather than going around in our head in our own loops. So I don't know if some of you are like me, but that's what I tend to do if I don't have an opportunity at times to reflect with others. So what have we observed? What have we felt? And examining our own thoughts and feelings, and stepping back from the direct experience so that we can then think about what's going to best meet the parents and families' goals and needs at this point. And I'll talk a little more about this, but it's impossible to have a reflective supervisory relationship unless we've got a foundation of trust and a sense of safety. So I have to feel that I can express my thoughts about what's going on without fear of reprisal, and without thinking that my supervisor is going to think, wow, she's lost it, she can't handle this, So we can get anxious and upset, but when we're in the presence of somebody that can be calm and supportive and be with us, that can help us to then think better. And for those of you that may be thinking, well, wait, is this supervision or what? It's not therapy, so we should be really clear on that. And reflective supervision can be handled in a one-on-one supervisory meeting, and it can also be team-based. And so it's a process in which we are really guided by knowledge and support that our supervisor and peers might provide for us to help us figure out what makes sense now, to make decisions, to figure out what we're going to do. It also, as I was saying earlier, can help us contain and manage our own stress on the job and gives us the tools that we need. And the second part, the collaborative part, recognizes that there are power differentials in any supervisory relationship, and being collaborative is about sharing power and entering into dialogue. So we can learn from each other, and what happens then is we can share responsibility, enter into collaborative problem solving and decision making. And in the Chicago area, we ran a group of quarterly supervisors meetings about a year ago or so with folks that had gone through an in-person foundational training that we offered through our Chicago office here. And one of the huge takeaways for those supervisors as they started to really learn more about reflective supervision was they went back in, they practiced it with their staff, and they invariably they came back and said, wow, you know, I realized I don't have to have all the answers, and it's okay to say I don't have all the answers. And the supervisors really reported that they felt like a weight was lifted, that it's not all up to me, which is really how so many supervisors do feel. And I know before I had exposure to this, I certainly felt that way. Then the third component of reflective supervision is that it's got to be consistent, and there has to be sufficient time that we're spent in this so that I can do my job well. And I can learn and grow within this position. So it's not enough to occasionally have a reflective supervisory meeting. It's got to happen at a consistent time. Ideally, depending on how many people you're supervising, it should happen weekly, because it gives the message, you can count on me. And I'm going to protect this time to the best of my ability from cancellations, and I'm not going to be constantly rescheduling our 10 o'clock time on, you know, Wednesday morning. So we know in this work that crises come up, and that, you know, we can't always make these meetings. But if, in fact, we're finding out that one or the other that is not making it to these meetings, or there's lots of cancellations, then really trying to step back and reflect on what's going on here. Is there some tension related to having these meetings that we need to think about further? And so supervisors can think about that, and so can the supervisees. I hear DV program supervisors or coordinators saying a lot, well, I have an open door policy. So when my door's open, people can come in at any time, and I'm available. And so they know they can count on me. And I think that, you know, depending on where I'm at in my job, if I've just started and I need specific things, or something comes up that's really a crisis within the work that I'm doing and I'm not sure what to do, then of course it's so important to have an open door policy. But I think from what I've heard, that people that can institute a kind of more regular, consistent practice, that they're finding that over time, when frontline staff know, hey, I can count on this time, it's protected, I've got this hour, then it's times easier then to say, oh, okay, I can bring this up in supervision. And so in some ways, for the program manager or supervisor, you're not continually having a revolving door of people in and out of your office either, because you've got some time set aside when you're really there and present and you can be there together. So I want to encourage this for those of you that haven't thought about this or tried this or knowing too much about it. Okay. Oh, the other pointer about this, and we certainly went through this with others that I've been mentoring around reflective supervision, that if this is a 180-degree turn for you in terms of what your style is, that it's really helpful to be transparent about it and to say, you know, I just got some training about this with some other peers, and I want us to try it out. And so it may feel a little weird as we're transitioning to this. And here's what it's going to look like, and here's how it might be different than what we've done before. And here's why I think it might be helpful for us. And so you kind of approach it from a standpoint that's actually very collaborative, saying, you know, this is new for both of us, and we'll be finding our way together and evaluating what it's like. So here are some of the main components of reflective supervision. And I think if as a supervisor or supervisee you're thinking about making this transition to having reflective supervision, then it's always helpful to reflect on what were my prior experiences like? What were those qualities in a supervisor that I had that were really helpful to me? What was that about? So thinking about that, what if I'm a supervisor, do I not want to repeat or replicate? And thinking about that, you know, on a timeline. And at the same time, recognizing that whatever was really, really helpful to me may not be as helpful to everybody that I supervise, and being able to differentiate, and that's the individualized piece here, what people need. So we talked about how it's got to be built on a foundation of honesty and trust, got to feel safe, got to somehow create a safe space within the relationship. And some of that comes from having a consistent, regular time that we can meet and testing out. So if I say things and you see me feeling really dysregulated, does that come back to bite me, you know, in the future? Or do you really take it in stride and see that this is part of doing the work and help me recognize that it's pretty typical to feel that way and it's okay, and that you know that you can take in everything that I feel. So it also is very special because it highlights how we can learn, and I'm thinking about this also in terms of children in the context of relationships. So in several of the prior webinars, we talked about the circle of security and our own attachment relationships as children and as adults with our intimate partners and friends and family, colleagues. And so in this context, think about the supervisory relationship as both a secure base from which I can go out on the top of that circle and enter into my work, but also know that within the sanctity of the supervisory relationship, I can come back to a safe haven where I can really examine what I experience. I can get help with what to do next, what my feelings are. I can feel grounded, reassured, get the information that I need to go forward. Mary Claire Heffron and Trudy Murch, who are in the early childhood field, have done some wonderful work in this area, and we've borrowed heavily from them. And one of the quotes that they say about reflection that I think is worth sharing with you is the following. Reflection involves making time and opening up space for emotional and intellectual exploration, for not knowing, for perspective taking, for musing, and for a kind of playfulness that leads to creativity. And I want to highlight the piece about both the playfulness and the not knowing, so that we can face situations together where we may not have the perfect resource or the perfect thing to do or to say, but we can hold that together, and we can hold that not knowing, and we can also figure out and get consultation or get other resources or help or ideas from others who might be able to bring some knowledge and understanding to bear. So it's also strength-based. How are we as supervisors helping supervisees recognize their own strengths and skills in doing the work? And there's a parallel to thinking about how we bring that out with parents and children and families as well when we think about fostering resilience and healing. And then the professional growth piece. So it's not just about how well I'm filling out my paperwork and how many people I'm seeing and what the feedback is, but it's also an investment in me, in my growth and learning and getting the skills that I need. And to me, I think that's just a tremendously exciting aspect of our work. And then it's individualized. So it may be very different depending on what my style is and what my supervisor's style is and what I need. And sometimes I have found over the years that I may have a staff person that really doesn't naturally or want to talk about or process their feelings or experiences. But as we build trust in the relationship by, I've got some specific resources or contacts that's helpful to that person in doing their work, that over time, more can come into the relationship. And the same is true for our relationships with families, right? And so then the active listening piece. What's being said and what are we picking up within the relationship that's nonverbal. And again, that's parallel to what we talked about in the webinar on engaging in sensitive conversations with survivors. And it's that active listening, empathic inquiry, all of those pieces that are part of this work. Okay. So here are some frequently asked questions. Okay, so if I do this, some people feel like, oh, this seems so touchy-feely. I don't know. If I, how do I have that perspective? And then if I'm sharing power and responsibility, what happens if there are issues that come up? Then what do I do? And so I say absolutely reflective supervision holds the administrative frame. And but the difference may be that you're also hearing, holding, and valuing the supervisee's perspective. And you're understanding what the issues might be in the context of what's happening for that particular staff person in the moment. And then I think that can lead to some collaborative problem solving where the sort of judgment, frustration, whatever gets stepped out of the picture, and again, we can approach things then that may be real issues for us. So it doesn't mean that when you're being reflective, you're not being honest or you're not raising issues, because we do. So to be effective, if there are things that I'm concerned about with a staff person that I'm supporting, they either may be avoiding addressing it or they may be unaware of it. And so I think this certainly came up for me a lot as a supervisor around the issue of boundaries. So thinking about how we define our work and our roles and that boundary between personal and professional relationships. And so I have one family that just really pulls at my heartstrings. So I may be getting resources for them that I'm not getting for others within the program. I know that's shocking, but we know that that happens, right? Or I may say things like, oh, there's no resources for this family, and staff may feel inclined to say, you can stay at my house for a few nights with your family. Or if it's center-based work, I can provide child care for you this weekend and help you out in a pinch. And so it's really exploring this, because I think if we don't have that open relationship, some of this happens and we may become aware of it when it's an issue. And this is a big, big piece that maybe deserves its own webinar, where we can talk about, if you live in a really small, close-knit community, what happens when you have you're part of social groups that intersect. You're both going to AA meetings, or you are worshiping at the same religious organization, etc. So that's an important piece. So on the second question about quality of service and secondary trauma responses, one of the things that we talked about is expect that people are going to have secondary trauma responses in doing this work. It's not the lone person that's going to have this. So, and we want to think about this in the context of what's happening for this staff person in the moment, and how that might be affecting how that person's relating to others and their work and what's happening in their current lives. So naming it, thinking about it, not doing therapy, but looking at what's going on. So, you know, maybe I'm going through a painful or very contentious divorce process after experiencing domestic violence. I may have a much more difficult time helping and supporting a survivor who's going through the same process at this time. So the other kind of flip piece of this is, as supervisors and managers, what's going on for us that might get activated by the person that we're supervising and supporting, and being able to have a place where we can reflect and manage our own stress if we feel that this staff person's performance and how they're doing is affecting the shared workload or other issues. Okay. So this is just a quiz. That's an 18-person quiz, 18-item quiz that you might be interested in taking if you are a supervisor, to begin to think about how reflective your style is. Okay. So when we have the opportunity to receive reflective supervision and consultation, it helps us to offer services for children, parents, and families that are more relational, reflective, and strength-based. And so that's what we mean about a parallel process. What we receive and take in through opportunity and support for supervision, reflective supervision, and consultation, we are able to offer others. And your handout, I'm just going to, let's see, I thought I could toggle between. Okay, so some of you have been able to download this, some of you have not yet, so I want to just put it up on the screen. I've really talked about this in more depth when I went through the components just now of what's in the left-hand corner of what reflective supervision is about. And then what we've done on the right side of this is to look at how does that fit within our domestic violence services and programs. And we developed these materials with a cohort in the Chicago area that I was working with and mentoring, and we tried this out in the quarterly supervisors meetings that I mentioned that we did about a year ago. And one of the supervisors who was working in a large human services agency, and she was oversighting their domestic violence services and some other programs, and she took this, she put it up on her bulletin board in front of her, and she made copies for all of her 16 staff, and she handed them out to them. And prior to that time, she had never had an individual meeting with any of her staff, and it certainly was unrealistic for her to have weekly meetings with each staff person, even in the future after, taking this in. But she did have individual meetings, and she also incorporated this approach. So she did both. She incorporated it into her team-based meetings that were weekly. And she came back to the next quarterly meeting, so this was a few months later, and she announced to us that after instituting these changes, that she had experienced a profound change in her relationship with staff and in the way that staff were offering services. And in addition to that, she was receiving emails from staff expressing their appreciation. So huge pitch for this. Okay. So this might be a good time to pause. We've got about 15 more minutes left. I'm going to answer a few of the selected questions that you gave us and give you some opportunity. Okay, I see a couple of questions. Let's see. One of the questions from Jennifer Riley is, I'm very interested in family parenting support groups. Is that an appropriate role of an advocate to have as facilitating that group, or would that be considered therapy and need to be done by a therapist? So that's a great question. I think that it depends on what particular curriculum you're following and what you see as the needs. So for instance, Circle of Security parenting can be done with an advocate and a mental health clinician together when people have training in that. I think the same is true for the Kids Moms Empowerment Program that Sandra Graham Berman has done at Michigan, where she's co-trained people. So it really depends on what you're offering, and I think not so much that it's probably very therapeutic. I think that if it's a clinically based program where you're working on working through past trauma to resolve it, then I would say that's probably more in the province of a therapy group. So I hope that answers your question in part, Jennifer. And if you've got more questions about that, you can certainly feel free to email me or we could talk. Okay, great, go on then. So here are some selected questions that I'm going to give you some meaty answers to that came up from you. Okay. Supporting protective parents. So the first question is around helping, in our work, helping survivors who are feeling guilt or shame around what their children have experienced. So, of course, it's natural that as parents, we want to protect our children from harm. So we, by its very nature, the DV survivor was not having control over what was happening to her and to her children, either directly or indirectly. What they saw, what they heard, what they might have been directly forced to do that was part of participating in the abuse. So guilt and shame are huge. They're big. So if we know that that's going on because a parent shares that with us, then I think the first step in supporting that parent is to allow and to create a safe space to share those feelings that can be listened to and to hold them, because the pain of those thoughts and feelings can be very overwhelming. And it's really important that we kind of check ourselves and try not to fix it and make it better all at once by our words, but to actually be there and experience it. And it can be very hard for us to hear it as well. There may be other folks, parents, who we have the sense that they're operating with a lot of shame around what happened and blaming themselves. but they haven't verbalized it or acknowledged it yet. And so I think in those situations, we can talk around it, we can kind of universalize what happens, and we can also support parents in ways where they start to feel a little better about themselves before diving into that kind of deep well of guilt and shame. And then I think that's true for any of us, right? So after we've been able to hold, and you know, it's not just one conversation, and it won't just come up once, but to be able to at some point normalize the feelings and also kind of gently remind the person that we're supporting that the situation was beyond their control in many ways. And they may have internalized something very differently about it, like this was my fault. And they may, or they may blame themselves if they're in shelter now for not leaving sooner, if that's the situation. Parents are going to worry and express all the time damage, quote unquote, that they feel they've done to their children. So as part of this process of working to support survivors, it's helpful to explore both their fantasies around how this has affected their children and their hopes for their children's future. And one of the things that I like to say, because I think this is so important and so true, is I've seen this over and over again. When children are doing better, when they feel better, their parents feel better. They feel better about themselves, they feel relieved, they feel more hopeful. And so getting to that point and being there with families is really, really critical in our roles. I think one of the things that can help parents, particularly if they're really mired in those feelings of blame and shame, is to work with parents during the process to use some positive self-affirmations around the ways in which they actually are really good parents to their children. And it may be in really small ways, but pointing that out and saying that and having them take that in. Sometimes it's helpful to carry around a little card in your pocket, or you know, put it up by your desk and look at it. And that's helpful in all kinds of ways, but helpful in this situation as well. And then the second question, how do we help parents help their children who are affected by trauma if they're dealing with their own trauma? So again, I think, you know, that depends on what's happening currently. What resources are there? What are they experiencing in the moment? If the domestic violence is ongoing and they're living with the abusive partner, then it's really hard to address that. If they're separated, what's going on? Where are they in their own healing journey? And you know, have we offered some education about the impact on children? Are we looking at that resiliency-based framework SAS with them? We may want to put some separate services and offer separate services in place for the children. If they're really young children, we believe that, and there's lots of difficulty that's there. I believe in a trauma-specific treatment called child-parent psychotherapy that I talked about in one of the webinars for kids under 6. But, you know, you just may not deal with it directly at first. We may have to build more positive experiences before you can rebuild that connection and then work on the impact of trauma. Okay, so a few other questions about family-centered services. So I think this came up when we were talking about doing an orientation together and intake together, and certainly we want to structure our services so that there's some private time that we have alone with parents to talk about things that are better said adult to adult and not in front of children. And then if we see things that might be jarring, that can feel jarring for us, like a parent maybe saying things about their child, and it's not the child that we're seeing in front of us, particularly when they're really negative attributions that a parent's making. And we can try to reframe that. You know, you can say things like, I know you really want the best for Johnny, and when he pulls his younger brother's hair, you want to teach him how to be a kinder older brother. So that you put it in the framework of what the parent's trying to do. They might be screaming at their kid in the moment, but you know, you kind of frame it with where their positive intention is. Let's see, is there something else I want to say? Oh, yes. So if we have a relationship that's established that's pretty solid with the parent, then we can say things like, wow, you know, Mary looked really sad and upset when you said that. So that we're gently having the parent recognize what the impact of what they're saying in front of their children might be. And the second one, I think I've already spoken to about we can't, on our own, keep children safe and talk separately to their parents without having other support in staff, from other staff, and figuring out how we're going to do that, because it's a critical aspect of delivering services. And then I love this next question because it's such a thoughtful one. Is it helpful to promote fun during center-based group sessions even if the family's not safe at home? So again, we're wanting to look at what's the nature of our group sessions. Is it an open group, a closed group? How well do we know the kids and their family situation? What are the topics that come up? What are the activities? How are we structuring it? We know that kids like predictable routines and structure that they can count on every time in a group. That sort of creates some safety and holding for kids, so that's really important. We want to do pacing within groups so that kids have trauma-informed choices and options, but that every kid gets to participate in some way. So, you know, we work on self-regulation things like learning belly breathing and other activities that can promote self-regulation when kids are upset, so that that's part of what we're doing. And then, you know, many kids really are able to compartmentalize. So they're able to come in to a group and have fun, and for the moment not think about what's happening at home. And that's a real achievement. And that's really important. Some kids are going to have a harder time with that. But if all children, if they experience laughter and fun within the context of a holding relationship, right, and a safe relationship, that's going to help them build resilience. And it's going to give them a greater ability to cope with what's going on at home. Final question. Advocating for children who may be misdiagnosed. We talked about, is it ADHD or is it a kid who's having trouble concentrating because they're worried about what's going to happen to the parent when they're away, or because of what happens to our stress response systems and in our bodies, we have trouble concentrating, right, if we've experienced trauma. So I think couple thoughts. One, it's always helpful to gather more information and what were the observations that were made and what are we basing this diagnosis on. Really talking frankly with parents and with school folks and whomever, or pediatricians, whoever is making this recommendation for medication. So often parents don't want their kids on medication. So really figuring out where's the parent in this. They may feel like they don't have any other options because the psychiatrist or their pediatrician said you've got to do this, or the school saying we're not going to be able to keep this kid in class if they're not on medication. So I'd like to explore with the parent, what's this kid's history been? Have they ever been on meds? Has anyone in the family ever been on meds? What's that experience been like? What do they understand about it? And then help the parent make a more informed decision. And then give information to folks that we're collaborating with, community partners, if they're not particularly trauma-informed and they don't understand maybe another way to look at the child's behavior. And then building collaborative relationships with trauma-informed mental health providers and teachers so that we can draw upon that and those experiences. And we can offer some ways like self-regulation techniques and ways to calm down and what special things a child might need. Okay. I haven't seen, I kind of drew this out a little longer because I hadn't seen new questions popping up, and you are always invited to email me directly if you've got some thoughts or questions that come up that you'd like some more answers to. So with that in mind, I wanted to thank you so much for your participation today, and I'm going to, let's see, oh, I should put my contact information, that slide on there, sorry about that. So you have that in your slides, and I want to turn it over to Erin now.
Excellent, thanks so much, Susan. I just want to go ahead and thank Susan again for such an exceptional webinar today, but also more generally for such an incredible series. Thank you to Caption Colorado for providing today's captioning, and thank you to Jen Curley for making the webinar run so smoothly. Last but not least, thank you all for spending your time with the center. Within the next week, I will send you all a follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's webinar in addition to the slides and handouts that Susan referenced, all of which will be available on our website. You'll also receive a certificate of attendance for your time today. At the end of the webinar, when you close out the window, you will be taken to a very brief evaluation. If you could please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better, it would be greatly appreciated. And as a reminder, for those of you who might be interested and haven't had a chance to register yet, we have a webinar coming up next week called Mental Health and Substance Use Coercion, the results of 2 national surveys and implications for practice. The webinar is on Tuesday, March 31st at 2 p.m. Central Time, and you can register on our website or in the link that Jen just posted in the chat box. So thank you all again, and we hope you all have a great afternoon.